So this is my slightly battered, worse for wear sketchbook that I've been painting in for the last 32 weeks, I think it is. And it was a project suggested by my good friend Debbie Crawford, that we paint weekly and chat about what we're painting. So I was a bit concerned that I wouldn't be able to do that weekly, so I started basically. I made the book using Saunders Waterford paper, watched a video on YouTube and stitched it together. Not very well, but it holds together. It's all the work in one place, and it's decent sort of hardware in Saunders Waterford paper. Not the greatest paper for the finest detail, I find, but it's a sketchbook and it's good. You know, it's one of the more robust papers. I'll take some punishment. So started off, it was quite lean at that time of year with subjects, so getting all the budding trees there at the start was quite interesting. I can return to them later and add ivy, berries of course. Here maybe I'll add a flower in that space there, so it's quite nice to return and add things later. At this point I hadn't really got a focus. This was growing in the garden. It was the only plant in this garden when I moved here a few years ago, so I decided I would paint it. It's really quite pretty hellebore. Some found twigs and cherry blossom locally. Then I decided maybe I would focus more on native plants and try and include quite a bit about reproduction, which is kind of like my area that I studied at university really, and I've sort of forgotten about a bit. So it was nice to revisit and see how the project evolved over time. Fritillaria I've painted many times in paintings, so it seemed like a natural thing to include, and quite a nice bit on the reproductive strategies in it. Pasque flower for Easter, and a little egg that I found in the garden. It just turned up, and I had to paint one for a commission, so I painted it, and it just happened to be lying in the soil in the garden, so I painted it here and used it for the commission. Dandelion, now here you see a big gap in the binding, and that's just poor construction by me. Doesn't really matter, I don't care. It still works. It's quite hard to pull them together. The paper's quite thick, so it's quite hard to pull it tight. So Dandelion, never painted it before, so it's quite nice to study it in a bit more detail. And I liked it so much I did it over 2 weeks. So I did the overhead view, which is the view that we generally come across in the garden or wherever, which my garden's full of. The wild cherry, I came back later and added this in July, the fruits, which kind of livened up the page then. I left a gap for it. Sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable to leave a gap for something, so I just sketched in where they would be and had a plan to add them later because they're so pretty with the colour. Again, reproductive dissections enlarged with scale. Apple blossom, always nice. Again, added the little developing apple later on. And put the date there when it was added, 17th of July, my daughter's birthday in fact. Bluebells from Keel Woods, where my other daughter is at university. It's a beautiful wood there. And some bracken as well on furling, reproductive parts. This one, the Lily of the Valley, was actually from my grandmother's garden, and my mother gave it to me recently for this project, so it's now in my garden as well, so it's passed through 3 generations there, and hopefully it'll flower next year. No fruits on it though, no berries on it unfortunately, which would have been nice. So I was a bit short of time because I was working on a commission at this point, so I decided to do 3 weeks over a 2-page spread of these little clumps, which is really kind of nice to do. A lot of negative space painting, and it's 3 plants that grow in the graveyard next to the flat where I used to live. Dog rose, always pretty. Again, added the fruits, the hips, later on in September the 4th they were added. The original entry was June the 14th. Again, another dissection. This was a disaster page really, because something got into the book, an insect, and poor thing got squashed, so it's a big stain. So I decided I wasn't going to paint on it and try and work it into it because it was a bit of a mess, and just wrote a little tiny essay on how we value plants or don't value them in some cases. And vetch, which grows in the garden, has this sort of fascinating relationship with ants on these little nectaries on the stipules there, which is quite interesting. Love this plant. It climbs through the lavender in the garden. I week 21 here with the white clover, which is actually quite pink in the garden. Very important plant for nitrogen fixation through the root nodules here with this just painted in there. Wanted to include that in it. Also got a big fat bee that isn't very good either. Honeysuckle from Barlaston Downs, which is an area just down the road from here where I used to go as a child to walk the dog. Again, came back and added the fruits later. I love the way this sort of climbs and sprawls, so again it's perfect for a double page spread. The opium poppy grows on the in the garden, just sort of seeds itself, and on the farm down the lane it's all over the sort of waste ground and that, so I wanted to include that because it's a sort of common feature here locally. So the rose bay willow herb was a plant that I had intended to continue my studies with years ago at university, but I think something else came along and I didn't go down that route, so it's quite interesting to go back to it and sort of have those memories of what I learned about it at that time sort of revisited. Geranium grows down here by the canal and various other places. I love the seed head structure, how these sort of curl and spring and up to disperse the seeds. It's an incredible sort of mechanism of seed dispersal. This St. John's wort, I just don't know where it came from. It just appeared in the garden. So it was just there. It was like it had been provided for me when I was struggling to think what to paint that week. There it was, and it's very pretty as too. Knapweed, again from the canal, where an area where they were chopping down some old diseased trees. There was lots of it just trampled, so I took a bit of that home actually. Did a nice dissection and put it under the microscope, which is fun to do. And I was trying to hold off on doing fruits until the second part of the book, but I couldn't really resist doing the brambles, and how they have this sort of structure of this creeping sort of huge stems that emerge for next year's fruit. Quite like that idea with this year's fruit and the differences between the stems. And there was just one flower with some buds clinging on there at this time of year. That was in August the 20th. And this I came across in an area where I used to walk. It's not far from here, a few miles away. I never saw it there before, and it's the muskmallow, which has that musky smell. And it's really a very pretty plant with beautiful petals and colour, delicate, and these fascinating seed heads, these sort of flattened seed heads. And then I decided to take a little trip to Scotland. Got in the car and drove to the very most southern tip. I went to the Botanic Garden at Logan and stayed not far away in a little cottage where all these plants were growing on the road verge, so it seemed like a good opportunity to paint them while I was there. And then the last page I did the rowan, which is now sort of past its best, but I kind of like that look, and I didn't really finish this. I just left it kind of unfinished, and I quite like the idea of being a bit more relaxed about these studies and not having them polished and finished, and that's where this one is. And again, it's moving into the fruits, which I'll be doing a lot more of in the next volume. So I wrote a little sort of index of what's included in the book, volume 1, and the dates, The dates that all the entries were made and the Latin names of all the plants. It's not very consistent. Sometimes I'll give the common name and the Latin name, and sometimes I just give the Latin name. It's just typical for me, really, not to be consistent in the approach. But there you go. So that's the first volume of the book. It doesn't sit together terribly well, so I'll tie it together with a ribbon or something.